Hey, David, thank you for coming in. You have such a marvelous background, dating from when you were a teenager and literally kind of the movie sort of scenario, like helicopter lands in the schoolyard. We are associated with top secret projects, and we want you, David. And then literally you're off doing just phenomenal work from a very early age, and you're continuing that phenomenal work. And I really encourage the audience to take a look at your profile. There's nobody in the world that can match that kind of profile. It's pretty amazing. Because you've done everything, you continue to do a lot of just transformational work. So thank you for coming in. And I think this is what our third interview, something like that. So
Yes, thank you, Stephen. It's always great to be here with you, and I have to say you were making me blush. Earlier this year, I actually got contacted from a classmate who knew me when I was a freshman in high school, and he said, "All I remember is somehow you were showing up with the U.S. Navy doing stuff with submarines." So, yeah, it is humbling, and the phrase "one is glad to be of service." And I also want to give kudos to you because you are definitely a champion of positive change agents. You create an environment that encourages everyone to be leaders. And so thank you, Stephen, for everything you do as well.
So again, I encourage the audience to go back to the two prior interviews because they'll get a sense of the scope of your work, and then of course the profile, which has hot links in it, so people can actually, kind of do additional drilling in. In fact, it's like a rabbit hole because there's so much there, right? I mean, pretty much in every space, and you want every conceivable award you can think of, and of course you have these top level security clearances. I mean, you name it, you've done it all. And you work with some of the top people in the world, like Vince Cerf and people like that. So, okay, so David, because we got the audience looking at sort of what you've done in the past, let's now look at what you're doing today, and if you can bring us up to date on some of the major projects you're working on, some of the goals that you're involved with, anything that you can foresee in the future. But so let's kind of break it into parts first. So let's get an update. What are you currently working on, and why is it important?
Sure. And what I'm working on right now has really been something that for some of us we saw was a long time coming. When I got back from Afghanistan in 2009, if you remember in the United States and around the world, we had the global financial crash. And so I got asked as a nonpartisan, what would be the future of work, not just in the United States, but in the world? And basically had 5 days to answer that question scientifically and came back and said, if we look at current trends, and this was 2009, if we look at current trends by the middle of the 2020s, and so where we are right now, we would have at least five technological revolutions, AI being one, and I know you are definitely championing that, Stephen, and helping to think about how we use AI for good. Also thinking about biotech, space, quantum, and then the miniaturization of, at the time we were calling it Internet of Things, drones, and robots, and then increasing miniaturization of them. And we know whenever there's one technological revolution in the world, let alone multiple ones, there's initially haves and have-nots. There's anxiety about how am I going to provide both for myself and for my family and for purpose. And if you look at the latest Edelman Trust Barometer from January of 2025, around the world, not just in any one particular country, we find that 61% of respondents have a moderate to high grievance against one or more groups. I would submit that's partly because the anxieties about the future have spilled over to anger, because at least with anger, the brain has a sense of control. It may be false control, but it's a sense of control, and that's led to grievances. And at the same time, 40% think it's legitimate to do an act of violence. And so you can look at world history, including the United States in the 1890s. We later saw this in the 1920s. There was actually the rise of what was called anarchy. And anarchists actually thought it was legitimate to use, unfortunately, TNT at the time, dynamite, to do acts of violence to innocents in society because they wanted to go back to, and their claims, they wanted to go back to a more peaceful way of life, even though it was obviously violence inducing. And so I raise that because we need to navigate our now, both from a perspective of business and how our business is going to thrive, and even more importantly, societies, because we may find that we look back and the decisions we made as to how we dealt with these technological revolutions in AI, space, bio, quantum and IoT ended up not giving us more freedoms or supporting the idea that we can be free societies that can still think differently and act differently, but still operate in a safe space. And so I'm working at the intersection of a lot of businesses that are trying to navigate the here and now and helping advise their boards and their companies. And at the same time, say, we're really in a fundamentally different era in the sense that now business has an outsized impact on what I will call governance. I'm not saying government, I'm not even saying more government, but governance, that providing the norms and stabilization effects, in some respects, are now landing in the hands of boards and CEOs that really are just used to the playbook of how do I return and how do I increase return on investment? How do I increase my profits? How do I increase my shareholder value? And what I'm striving to point out is if we don't also think about the civil spaces in which we operate, businesses as a whole may not actually have a marketplace to sell to.
Okay, so let me kind of drill into this further and maybe summarize, but I'm going to extend the technology. So, you mentioned a number of them. So I think of them as 11, supercomputing, chip technologies, advanced networks, quantum, advanced materials, the novel materials, also AI and machine learning, robotics and automation, which includes then drones and those kinds of things, biomedical innovation, neurotech innovation, brain-computer interfaces, energy, new kinds of energy and storage, and then advanced manufacturing and space technologies. And basically, a number of years ago, you predicted that these trends are going to have a major impact, and you're indicating that that's also creating uncertainty in the world, and that uncertainty is manifesting in fear. And then that fear is manifesting to people believing that they can do violent things, which is not good. And what you're suggesting is then that businesses can be a stabilizing force. So rather than just thinking about return of shareholder value and things like that, they're thinking about the broader implications to society, to the world, because that, and in fact, will also impact shareholder value, right? So they're thinking in a very broad, holistic sense, and can be a stabilizing mechanism because of all these shifts are occurring, and that's where you're consulting and advising, and you realize that this period of increasing uncertainty, with businesses now taking a more prominent role. Not to replace any institution, but just taking a more prominent role, they can have a dramatic effect and help, create more certainty in a sense, and also create some kind of more stabilizing ecosystem around the world. So, and you're a part of that program. Can you name specific programs that you're doing that makes this happen?
Sure. So one of them, I am very excited about what's called active inference with what's called the spatial web. And so what is active inference? It's a flavor of AI, and we should recognize that there are multiple sort of tools in the toolkits or flavors of AI, generative AI being one. And so if we think of that as a hammer, active inference is more like a screwdriver. And active inference, I have seen, for example, things that take generative AI models, I won't name the companies, but takes generative AI models on a cloud computing cluster upwards of 4 hours to sort of solve a problem. And this is more than just producing text. This is actually trying to do a reasoning-based problem. It takes them 4 hours. Active inference can do it 4 minutes on a laptop, obviously using less power. And so that helps solve some of the energy questions that you mentioned, but also allows us to actually have AI on the edge that, I remind people, if you got the latest model of the iPhone, you actually have more computing power than a Cray 3 supercomputer had in 1993, and you have it in your pocket, which is amazing. And so I would submit that the future of AI is not going to necessarily only be mega models that are in the cloud. If anything, there's going to be things that run locally in organizations, things that run on our own devices. And that then gets to the spatial web protocol, which is after about 5 years, IEEE successfully passed these standards. And just like how when we go on the web and we type in HTTP, that's Hypertext Transport Protocol, and we get a web page, which is Hypertext Markup Language, now we can do something called Hyperspace Transport Protocol, or HSTP, which sounds like something from Star Wars. It's not. But it basically allows us to have a way to identify anything in the physical environment that has either a physical coordinate, physical boundary, a space, time coordinate or a space-time boundary. So I could say, for example, within the 15 kilometers around Newark Airport, between the hours of 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., I want to allow the following things to happen autonomously. That may involve humans, but may also involve AI-directed activities. And then after 9 p.m., within this 15-kilometer radius, I'm okay with the other things happening. And so we actually now have a way to sort of do things both pre-compute before the AI has done something and actually say, like when I come to my house, I want the following things to happen and the following things not to happen. And then when I show up at work, I'm okay with these following things happen. And then maybe when I do go to an airport, or maybe I do go to a school where we need to make sure there's more safety involved, then I'm okay with biometrics being collected. And my phone is actually serving as that beacon that expresses what I'm okay with and what I'm not okay with. And then societies can in return give a choice architecture. You show up and you're not willing to give your biometrics, then unfortunately, because we have to be concerned about safety at airports and schools, someone's going to have to stop you and say you need to fill out some more information. But again, it's a trade-off as opposed to becoming either surveillance state or surveillance capitalism. And it's possible if we actually have businesses move forward on active inference and spatial web protocols. I'll give one other real quick example, which is we know that
So,
cyber. Oh, go ahead. Go
so,
ahead, Steve. Jump
so
in.
let's mine the active inference in the space protocol. I think that's really interesting. So, you're indicating that typically, even in this agentic sort of LLM deep research capabilities that are out there now, it could take some time to work on some kind of a problem. And as you mentioned, in hours and things like that. And it can't do it on the edge. It has to go to the cloud, to these hyperscalers and their large clusters and things like that. And they'll use a chorus of agents. Sometimes now they're using multiple different kind of agentic stacks from different providers and a chorus of LLMs. Microsoft AI Diagnostic is an example of this kind of capability, and you're seeing all the major providers doing this agentic kind of tooling. But you're saying that if you could maybe compress these capabilities, I know Multiverse, which is a support company for hardware, and Quantum has produced a technology where they can compress LLMs by about 95%. And they just recently raised a lot of funding. The idea here then is you can sit on the edge, you can do inference on the edge, it's faster, you can do real time. So you're suggesting that you're now working on real-time inference, and you're working on space protocol, so you can get this sort of multi-dimensional, high dimensionality in terms of automation because of the space protocol. That will then produce even more automation, more abundance, let's say, and the better capabilities and in terms of the granularity of what that automation will mean. And so that would be a significant leap forward. So that's did I get anything wrong in my
Oh, you
summation
got it
or
spot on. And I mean, just think about the value to businesses and that you could actually have confidence, because some of the concerns with generative AI by itself is, I remind people, the generativeness is actually a feature, not a bug. But how do you make sure that example that the generative AI stays within a certain scope? Well, that's where the spatial web protocols can kick in. And you can say, I'm okay with these following things happening, but beyond this, here's some boundary lines. And so it's exciting. It can also allow individuals, if you and I go to a shopping center and maybe you are more privacy aware, I'm less. And so I'm willing to have my information captured when I walk into the shopping center. And in return, I get discounts or coupons. But you're like, you know what? I don't want to give that information up. And so there's no targeted ads or no targeted coupons. It allows the idea that there's no one size fits all for us, not only within societies, within countries, but around the world. I often say standards are like toothbrushes. Everybody says they want to use one, they just don't want to use anybody else's. And so to expect that we're going to have one single AI policy across the entire world, it's probably not going to happen. I recently got asked to actually testify as an expert witness before Congress in the United States on the topic of AI, because when the founders wrote the Constitution, for some mysterious reason, they forgot to mention who gets to oversee AI. We'll follow up with them on that. But, and as a result, it's a state right, not a federal right, which means we're now facing more than 1,000 pieces of either passed or draft legislation across the 50 states, which I would submit, unless you're a very large business, there's no small to mid-sized business that has the legal staff to navigate all those different regulations. And this will actually be a stranglehold on innovation. And so I can make the case that this is a case where businesses can do something that actually allows not only for more autonomy of individuals in free societies, but it also helps with the business landscape so that you can be more innovative and you don't have to worry about 1,000 different pieces of legislation that do not come together in a way that cannot actually make business succeed.
Okay, so you've done an extension of the implications of this, but in your sort of just preceding statement, you're basically indicating a very personalized experience, but it's opt-in. You can determine the scope of that personalization. How much are you willing to share, and if you're willing to share more, you can get a more detailed, personalized experience. If you're not willing to share more, then you're not going to get that, but it's opt-in. You decide what that degree of engagement is. You also indicated and linked to your testimony to Congress that there's, 10,000 different little micro, macro legislation, regulatory protocols, things like that. And it's impossible to mine, and you're trying to create an overarching kind of simplification of that so that it doesn't act as an impediment to innovation and because of the sort of the bureaucratic layers that are out there, you're trying to simplify it so that it'll be an acceleration of innovation, but innovation on a basis of for good, or what I call tech for good. Okay, now earlier I interrupted you because I
Oh,
wanted to mine
Chris,
that
we have a
one
lot to
space
cover.
pro.
Yeah,
Yeah, so let's get into the second idea, and then I'll
sure.
probably pause and just kind of reflect on it, right?
Sure. So the second activity that I'm very much involved with is thinking about how we can transform the nature of supply chains. And as you've seen, I mean, obviously there's geopolitics now stepping in with supply chains. We've got the United States and the People's Republic of China having meetings, and we'll see what comes out later this year. And again, thinking about the reality that supply chains matter to businesses, but they also matter to societies. And so later this year, I'll be in Mexico talking about the intersection of, again, Internet of Things, these devices that now there's more than 50 billion network devices on the face of the planet relative to 8.2 billion human beings. And at the same time, anything that's 5G, and actually nowadays with even with Bluetooth, if any of us have a Bluetooth, that is discoverable from space, which is amazing. I mean, we're now able to do commercial capabilities that are at 0.25 meter resolution with a latency of just 15 minutes ago. And so businesses, especially in the agricultural space, but other spaces as well, can actually have near real-time awareness as to what is being grown or what's available for shipping or additional capacity on transport vessels, both land and sea and air. And I raise that because we aren't used to that abundance of information and data as to how do we optimize supply chains. And the reality is here on this planet, we produce enough food to feed people. We just can't get it to the right places. Same thing for potable water. And so what I'm excited about is this is a chance to actually help businesses have more visibility and resilience in their supply chains, but at the same time address some of the important goals of how do we make sure we get food to everybody? How do we make sure there's potable water to everybody? How do we make sure supply chains are less brittle, especially in the idea that different countries are putting in different barriers to things crossing countries, and also at the same time reduce on fraud. And so this now gets to another additional concept, which is, as I mentioned, these things are now discoverable from space. That's why the spatial web protocols are important, because maybe when I get home, I don't want my Bluetooth device or my 5G device sharing where I'm located. But if I'm in a business setting or I'm in a commercial setting, there's a thing called federated learning. And what is federated learning? Federated learning is the idea that instead of the data being shipped somewhere and then an AI training on it, I can actually have the AI algorithms come to where the data is. And so we can imagine there are agricultural cooperatives at the local level for farmers, especially in places like South America or Africa, where they may not have the cloud computing infrastructure, but they can come together and say, here's my data. If an algorithm is going to learn on it, here's the negotiated financial benefit. Maybe there's an equity benefit, maybe there's a non-financial benefit, but they can actually negotiate it and the data is not hoovered up, which is better from a cybersecurity perspective. And ultimately, it also allows us to actually create an economy that's not just based on the exchange of value in terms of money, but increasingly, I think data is as, if not even more important than money. And there can be a negotiation that says a farmer or someone with additional capacity for ground or air or sea transport, or someone that's just trying to understand where things are going in terms of the supply chain availability of a product or a service or a solution, can actually exchange those insights. And it's not just all being hoovered up by a few, but instead it's actually this sort of ecosystem of data arbitrage in which people actually have a choice and they can come together and negotiate that value with others.
Okay, so let's kind of reflect on what you just said, right? So you're working on supply chain, and we saw some of the brittleness of supply chain when COVID happened, right? Uh, and it became very clear our dependence on supply chain, where we used to take it for granted, right? And then because of some of the uncertainty that's occurring in different areas of the world, that's also has put a spotlight on the importance of supply chain and that it's really critical infrastructure, and we have to pay a lot of attention to it. Mind you, you have to get cooperation as well. But you're also saying because of the space protocol, the ability to inference on the edge, the ability to get, you said 5G, but also 6G, you have the ability to get really fine resolution of what's happening per device, per geographic location, per even sort of activity. And that really granular resolution can be mined because there's a lot of data there. But you don't want that data to go into the cloud in one repository. Because of your rapid, fast inference, you can actually have it on the edge. And that negotiation occurs on the edge, unlocking value. And that value on the edge doesn't have to be monetary. It could be some kind of relationship-based improvement or something like that, or like you said, more insights into the supply chain so that a local farmer in Southeast Asia can realize that maybe there's another community just next door that they can collaborate with because we're doing similar things, they can package their goods together. And because you've got this sort of unified picture of supply chains around the world, then you can also do some backstopping. In other words, if one isn't as reliable, then you can have sort of back channels, other channels, as they say, secondary channels you can rely on, and maybe even automate that process so you have failover. If one doesn't go through, then you got failover to another. But ultimately, because of this transparency in the global supply chain at the micro level, that'll just improve service. And so you'd have to have some kind of overlapping protocol to manage that. AI can automate, in fact, all of it. You can have agentic AI to automate all of it. So you're really trying to provide a solution to some of the major kind of blockages that are occurring around the world. And because you're being able to do it on the edge and the automation, the processing occurs on the edge, then what it allows you to do is also to have equity. So kind of like a fairness aspect. So it's not just concentrated on one group of people or one company and things like that. Did I capture that right, or did I
Got
miss
it
something?
absolutely right. And I really want to double click real quick because you talked about the concept of fairness. And just briefly, I point out, unfortunately, economics by itself does not have a concept of fairness. I often played a game. I actually had Vint Cerf on stage once where I had him play the bargaining game with someone else. I believe he was in the bargaining game, for those who aren't familiar, it's where hypothetically $100 is offered, where the first person gets to offer a percentage to the other person. And if the other person says yes, then they both keep it. If the other person says no, then nobody gets anything. And the question is, how much do you offer the other person? Usually, when you do it on stage, because it's visible to everybody, the first person offers 50%. Sometimes they even do more. But I say, what would economics by itself, just by itself, say is the rational amount to offer and the rational amount to accept? And the answer is a penny, because a penny is better than nothing. But we know intuitively that humans would say no to that. In fact, it's not just us. Chimpanzees will eat cucumbers. They don't really like cucumbers, but they'll eat cucumbers if given, up until the point where they see visually that another chimpanzee is being given a banana by a researcher. And all of a sudden, they go on a hunger strike. They reject eating the cucumbers, even though that's not rational because that's food. But they'll go on a hunger strike because they saw somebody else was getting something they thought was better. And I would submit what's happened with the internet, followed by smartphones and now AI, is people are seeing, in some cases, the reality, but a lot of cases just manufactured, in some cases even synthetic now, perception that somebody is getting something better than them. And so they're doing the equivalent of like going on a strike and saying, no, no, I don't want any cucumbers. I want the banana that everyone else seems to be getting. And I put that out because, again, going back to the moment we are in 2025, is the good news is we connected the planet. The challenging news is we connected the planet, and now we have to update how we do our science, our economics, our policy in a way that hopefully goes for more stability, less turbulence. Otherwise, we may find a funny thing happen on the way to globalization.
Okay, so let's kind of reflect on what you just said, right? So, because of the nature of technology, everybody has a cell phone or some kind of a watch or other device that gives out granular data that can kind of monitor what's happening around them, right? And that monitoring of what's happening around them makes them feel that somebody has it better. And that creates instability and uncertainty for that person and can lead to anger and, like you said, violence as well, right? So the kind of this polarization that we're seeing around the world. And a problem or something that's associated with is social media. So whatever social media channel you use will monitor what you're looking at and then feed you and accelerate that perception that I don't have what that other person has.
Right.
And so that increases this isolation and anger and kind of polarization and things like that. So this aspect of fairness and transparency and equity. And as you mentioned, that goes down to base states. You can see it even in other primates. If they see somebody else got something better, they'll even do something that's even harmful to themselves. There's no logic behind it because it's based on sort of primal
Right.
conditioning, evolutionary programming, and but by taking all of the things that you talked about, you can manage that so that people don't have this sense of unfairness and lack of equity and so on. And but you have to get collaborative forces around the world to kind of work with you. I mean, this is kind of this idea from Harvard, or 3.5% of a community can create systemic change, and that could be in your home, that could be in your school, it could be in your village, it could be at the state level, county, province. It could be an entire region or continent, just 3.5%. So what you're doing is you're creating these micro sub groups of this 3.5% of equity and fairness through automation and on the edge and transparency. So you can address the transformative challenges like geopolitical, economic, social, accountability, transparency, um, um, let's see here, risk and governance and privacy and all of these other kind of factors that are overlapping, and those are the transformative challenges. Some of this accelerated, by the way, because of all of this technologies that's out there. So that kind of capture what you were saying.
Absolutely, you did well. And again, Stephen, this is why I always enjoy working with you because you're clearly also working on these things and tracking them. And the two things I would say to people is history has shown it usually takes us 15 to 30 years to figure out the good, the bad, and the things we don't want to do with a new technology, about a generation. And the trouble is, we're going to see more change in the next 5 years than the last 20 years combined. And so we really are straining the absorptive capacity of societies, of businesses to keep up and to navigate this. And again, that's where I'm trying to make the case to those that have the opportunity that there are levers they can pull to actually make the business place more stable and more conducive as opposed to less stable, because that will ultimately hurt the business. And the other thing, and to your point, all of us can do something. It may be small. Maybe just we just engage people at our local level about we talk about these issues, or you spend some time volunteering at a school or something like that. But I do think there's an epidemic of what I call learned helplessness, where these issues seem so big, so macro that people just give up. And as you noted, you only really need 3.5, 4% of a population to do something, and that can be creating the difference between something that's a better future for us as opposed to one that goes through a period of darkness before it surfaces back up. I do believe eventually we will get through this. I'm just trying to make sure we accelerate towards solutions that are win-wins across societies, across nations, across businesses, because I do think in this we're all in the same pale blue dot together.
Okay, so let's look at how you're managing this kind of outreach, right, to bring different communities online. So I'm thinking that there's corporations and businesses, which you already talked about. You're bringing, getting CEOs to think in terms of the broader perspective, right, and the impact they have. So that's industry. There's also government bodies, different government agencies and associations. Some of them have changed significantly in different parts of the world, and so but they are still a lever of some sort. You also have nonprofits and NGOs, and then there's the UN and the different kind of capabilities they have. You have research groups, R&D groups, and things like that. You can, partner with universities and so on. There's media as well as a different kind of lever that you can manage. There's investment groups. Investment groups could be in ultra high net worth communities or in CEO communities like in YPO or Tiger 21 or ultra high net worth family offices, or it could be like VCs and private equity, or it could be sovereign funds. So there's all of this kind of capital that you can leverage to and work with from a community standpoint. And so, are you working all of these kind of different levels, including academic associations or science and technology associations? So you and I are both familiar with the IEEE and the ACM, and there's IFIP, there's industry associations like WITSA. And so there's all of these different kind of communities out there. Which ones are you working with, and can you give some examples?
Right. So there's sometimes when I wish that we could add more hours to the day, but unfortunately there's only 24 hours. The primary way that I decide where to place my focus, my energy is the place already aware that they cannot continue to do the status quo? Because there's lots of places that are still doing the status quo, and I'm like, you know what? I could spend the next 6 to 9 months making the case that you need to do something differently, or I could find places that are already aware things are on fire. We've got to do different playbooks. And the good news about our era is I think more people are realizing you cannot continue to use the same playbooks, even from just 3 years ago, because the world is changing so fast. And that does not mean you toss up your hands in the feet and you say there is no playbook. It just means you need to be adaptive and sort of always be learning. And so I do help with places that do investments, commercial investments, so private equity VCs. More on the side of a strategic lens of not just one company, but really sort of as they collectively place their bets across multiple portfolio companies, what is the seismic impact that is not just the return on investment for the investment firm, but on society? And so I'm fortunate and lucky enough that I'm able to be that choosy, I guess, in the assignments I pick. I also happen to work with entities that are wrestling with this on the front line. We didn't talk about it, but I am trying to help a biotech company who is in the area of both genomics, but also proteomics. And the question is, how do you do that in an era in which the good news is we are able to deliver personalized medicine to people? But you and I know, Stephen, that personalized medicine can be weaponized into personalized poison. So how do we make sure that's not the case? And one of the things I'm often out there saying is actually bio plus AI does not equal automatic doom. I feel like there's a whole lot of doomsayers that are out there, and I'm like, I'm not exactly sure about that because I did counter bioterrorism. I responded to the events of 9/11 and anthrax. The way we stop bad things from happening is not limiting information, but through non-obvious signals that something bad might be happening, and so we stop it. And I actually think the only way we get through adaptation of our changing environment, including the climate, is actually through biology. I've seen, for example, bacteria that can, one, pull methane from the environment. So that's a 22 to 40 times as bad greenhouse gas compared to carbon dioxide, uses methane as a sugar source, so it gets rid of it, and at the same time returns nitrogen to soil. And that is natural bacteria. It's not synthetic even. And so I think there's a lot of solutions out there that if you can work with the right companies, it can be done. So private equity, individual companies, because that keeps my skills focused and honed. I'm not just theoretical. I'm actually on the front line. And then anything I do for governments is actually pro bono. It's just easier that way. And so when was asked to speak before Congress, they only gave me about a week's notice. And I said, is it public or private? They said public. I said, oh. And I said, on what topic? And they said it was on state versus federal rights. And so I rapidly pulled that together, but it's an honor to serve. And so I think what we really need, though, is are creating spaces that encourage people to get off the sidelines. I think some people just feel like it's so turbulent, it's so scary that the playbooks have been burned. And yes, the playbooks don't work, that they would prefer to sit on the sidelines. And I really want to work with folks that are leaning in and saying the best way to predict the future is to create it. We can create it, and we can create it together.
Okay, so like again, reflect on what you've indicated. So you're choosing the areas in which you want to participate, ones which have a lot of headwinds or what we call friction, where you spend a
I like the friction.
tremendous amount, where you're spending a tremendous amount of time trying to move the needle, and it's not going to happen. You prefer to have areas where not necessarily group think, where you're just like all kumbaya, but at least they're open to diversity in thinking, right? So they're open to saying, hey, let's contemplate this. And then you have an opportunity to move the needle, right? So you're focusing on those communities globally in different areas that will do that. An example will be pro bono for the government. They gave you an opportunity to discuss some things that you wanted to. You can share some of your ideas of where things should be going, right? And what are the challenges and what are the ways to manage those challenges, create abundance and opportunity. You talked about biotech and the impact that it has. You also indicated that sometimes in people's minds they think AI, biotech, it's all bad, but not necessarily. In fact, most of biotech with AI is actually for good. For example, there was a supercomputer that sifted through, in fact, one of the national laboratories, right, sifted to 50 billion molecules for a new kind of cancer treatment, but it did that with AI, and this was done in a matter of minutes, and something that would have taken, well, it just would not be possible, even 4 years ago, using one of the exascale supercomputers. That's kind of this idea of AI and biotech for something that's useful. Another one that comes to mind is Pangea Data. They're a product of Microsoft Pegasus program. They've got an AI that can look at clinical records, then look at health records, and then it's identified something like over 90% of undiagnosed or misdiagnosed areas. And it's estimated that it can save the UK healthcare system £1 billion a year. And then again, this is kind of like sort of the intersection of AI and healthcare, and it can have a dramatic impact. Or I'm just thinking of Google, and they have this company that just they spun out, and it's using protein folding. So it's the AlphaFold 3 technology, and they've spun out a company, and that company, of course, is looking at even more than just proteins, but in cellular kind of virtualization. And there's even an attempt of virtualization, and AI is part of that, of a human being. And if you can manage that computationally, it's much cheaper, right? So it's a better kind of solution. So those are kind of use cases, the positive impact in biotech or healthcare. And so again, you're kind of, or not kind of, you are definitely working on the frontier to make a difference. Let's now change into a kind of another direction because we'll be running out of time. And this is on this area of I mentioned, supercomputers, chip technologies, advanced networking like 6G. I also mentioned quantum advanced materials, AI and machine learning, robotics and automation, which includes things like drones. You mentioned IoT and on the edge, and we already talked about biotechnology innovation. And then there's, brain-computer interface, neurotechnologies. There's energy and storage and advanced manufacturing space. Now you pick one of those and predict where we're going in the next 5 years, or
All
more than one. We'll see how much
right.
time.
I'll go with first one and then we can, because I would love to hear your thoughts too, Stephen. I would say, I think I am really interested as to where we're going with what I will call the collective intelligence of miniaturized robotic devices. Because in some respects, there's a convergence between what used to be called an Internet of Things device, a robot, and a drone. We're seeing these things get smaller and smaller. I've seen, for example, robots slash drones the size of the fingernail on your thumb, if not smaller. And then that gets interesting because then they can actually do some collective activities for good. For example, in a future earthquake, if you're trying to rapidly identify where there are survivors that might be trapped underneath rubble, you rapidly, deploy these miniaturized devices that themselves are, you know, fairly inexpensive. They may even actually extract energy from either the acoustics in the environment or the radio frequencies in the environment or things like that. And if they pick up a vibration of somebody knocking on rubble saying, I'm trapped underneath here, they can rapidly send the signal, and then you can get the first responders to that. I think there's other things that we can also look at in terms of just having a better sense of how do we do a good job with public safety? How do we actually help with making sure we're doing a good sort of responsibility for natural resources? Now, at the same time, all these collective swarm behaviors could also be very risky. And I know people can probably think of sci-fi scenarios. And that's where, again, I think we're going to have to move to a society where it's a level of N of one, or maybe if you're busy, you say, look, I care about this group, and this group can help specify what I do and do not want done to my person. Unfortunately, we are seeing examples of drones being used to kill people. Obviously, I'm not for that, but we've got to think about how you can't just wait for a national response to that because I think that's going to be too slow of a loop. How can it actually be where you say, I don't want the following things to happen within this perimeter. I don't want these following things to happen to my person. And so if a miniaturized robot drone slash swarm is coming, I have the following recourse. It could be either dazzling them so they can't find you. It could also be EMP or jamming or things like that. So to me, that is an interesting space because we haven't really seen true swarm behaviors yet, beyond what sci-fi has come up with. And I think there's going to be some interesting applications, including construction. Construction is an industry, by the way, where we have seen less than a 1% improvement over the last 20 years in that industry. And if we can get just a 2% improvement in construction, which I think is possible with miniaturized robots and drones, again, not replacing people, but augmenting them, that's 1.6 trillion US dollars. So I'm excited in that space, and I think we should watch that space.
Okay, so let's kind of mine this a little bit further. So you're talking about, and you can even extend this to nano robots and things like that that are injectable in people, right? So, and then larger size, they could be ant size or bee size. There, in fact, they already exist. And there is some intelligence resident on the edge within these devices. But now you're talking about collective behavior, kind of like a hive mind, like bees working in unison, or being able to communicate about working in unison, in essence, or swarm behavior. And then because of the new Bluetooth kind of technologies with extended range and lower latency to a 6G, which gives you, again, sort of a much lower latency and you can get real-time activity. This allows then collective swarm activity over even a larger distance and this kind of interconnection that's occurring, but a lot of local processing at the miniaturized level, and then that being shared within the kind of the swarm or hive community, and really modeling what we already see in nature with termites and ants and bees and things like that. And you even see that somewhat even with birds, right? When they're in flocking and flying in migration or butterflies. So we have models that we can emulate and we have enough automation capability that now it's just a matter of saying, okay, let's establish some protocols on how this is governed, but how they can communicate, things like that. And then, as you mentioned, it can improve things like construction, that additional intelligence. It can help in disaster relief. Right now, when you have an earthquake or something like that, you don't know where the people are trapped. If you mine the swarm behavior, this collective intelligence behavior, then you can actually pinpoint precisely where each one of these areas are occurring. Now, if you are able to kind of collect that collective intelligence of all of these different devices, continent-wide or over an ocean patch, or you can then predict maybe tsunami behavior or earthquake behavior or weather patterns. And so even things like a torrid or rainfalls and things like that. So I mean, the impact will be in everything. It's just every aspect of society would be. So that's an interesting thought. Did I miss anything?
You got it. And I would say what's fascinating is, the convergence of swarm behavior in with miniature devices at the physical level with the digital world. I actually think the future of AI is going to be millions, if not billions, of locally optimized AI models. There might be one that is just monitoring ships going in and out of the Suez Canal. And so if one gets stuck, it has a conversation with adjacent sort of smaller AI models and saying, I've seen this. How might this impact you? And then that's when then another one that's been looking at, for example, containers coming into LA port, because sure enough, this did actually happen when the ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. Less than 48 hours later, there were not enough containers coming to LA port. That caused a spike in the price of certain metals because everyone was building containers. And for the next 6 to 9 months, you could get plenty of Rolls Royces and Mercedes Benzes shipped to the United States, but you couldn't get quart-sized cans of paint because they couldn't eat the increased cost and trying to actually ship those things. And so no one AI is going to solve that. But if you think again, these swarms of ant-like or bee-like AI models, whether they be in the physical world or the digital world, that's where we get these emergent collective intelligence behaviors. And I would submit at the end of the day, we humans are individually intelligent, but we're also collectively intelligent in teams, in groups, in companies, and ultimately countries and societies.
Yeah, and then actually you could even extend that to people, right? People wear smart watches, they have smart rings, they have smart glasses, they have smartphones. So there's a lot of intelligence amongst the 8.2 billion people on the planet. A lot of
Right.
them have some kind of electronics on them. And it's just a matter agreeing to anonymization of that data. Then you can also spot things way before a pandemic, for example. You can
Oh,
spot a
that's what I did in
cluster.
a past life. Yes. We knew about, for example, the original coronavirus, SARS. We knew about it 5.5 months before it was raised to the world stage, partly because the price of garlic had gone up tenfold in Southeast Asia, which, it's seen as a cure. So if you see a price spike, that tells you something. And then two, not tracking individual people, that was not what we did, but we could see there was reflections of sunlight from more cars in parking lots around hospitals as opposed to factories. So imagine we don't have to wait for world governments to tell us something. We can actually all be collectively smarter from, again, don't want to do anything that erodes privacy, but the collective patterns of life on the planet can actually get us way ahead. This was 5.5 months before anything reached the world stage for the original coronavirus.
Yeah, I mean, you can employ differential privacy, right? So, and then really you could mine the 8.2 billion people as another IoT, right? Because
As
we're,
long as, again, as long as you anonymize appropriately, or again, it could actually be data collectives. It could be, farmers, it could be health practitioners. They say, in return for this, we want the following financial or non-financial. Maybe I care about, research for Parkinson's. And so I'm willing to share my anonymized health data as long as it leads to a cure for Parkinson that is available and accessible to all.
yeah, and then you include all of the IoT capability that are in cars and our fridges. And so there's a lot of collective information there. And if you can, well, it is possible. It needs collective will, right?
Leadership. And the trouble is everyone right now is, I mean, and I know we're getting short on time. I would say I feel like, the world has always been 90% short term, and I get it. That's part of gotta address it here now, 10% long term. I feel like we have gotten to with 2025 and the volatility and the turbulence, we're now 99.999% short term, and maybe if we're lucky, 0.001. And I'm trying to find that 0.001 where they're willing to balance, yes, you got to do short term, but also think long term. But coming from experience, I hate to say it, usually when we get that extreme where we're tossing long-term thing out the window, that's usually when something breaks or something bad happens. And so partly what I'm also trying to do, in addition to try and bring about good outcomes, is try to shore up those things that we don't want to break or be there to try and respond as rapidly as possible. Because I think, again, it's a balance. Yep, 90% short-termism, got it. That's human nature. But if we don't think long-term, usually that harms either businesses, harms societies, harms countries, and I'm hoping we can shift the pendulum back in the coming year to yes, 90% short term, but also recognizing we've got to scan the horizon. And again, the best way to predict the future is to create it.
So I just want to indicate, David, and all of my interviews are unscripted, so we didn't agree to topic areas, so we're just kind of riffing off each other in real time. Well, in essence, we're recording in real time, though it gets
Yeah. I love the jazz sessions with you, Stephen.
so just to the audience, we're just kind of freewheeling, right? And we could have a lot of fun. At some point, we need to be on stage together, no
Yes.
script. We just have a chat. and we just go where it goes, and then we can do some interaction with the audience in between different topic areas. I think it would be a lot of fun. I think we'd need at least an hour.
Yes.
So, uh, but it would be a lot of fun, wouldn't it?
And we invite audience questions because that would
Yeah,
really be
yeah,
lively.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. We just like, you would broach a topic and then we discuss it and then we say, what do you think, audience? Right. And then we take another topic and then the audience can suggest topics and then we give our viewpoint on that topic, right? So it would be a lot of fun. Hopefully we could manage this somehow between the
I
two of
know
us.
a few people I'm going to email once this goes live, and I'm going to send the video and say, let's get on the agenda. So I will take that as an action item, Stephen, because yes, I agree. I always, it's fun producing melody and harmony with you.
So David, this is the last question. So what recommendations and questions you want to leave the audience? So two things, recommendations and questions you want to leave the audience.
Mhm. So it's interesting. I got a notification a while back that said, "Congratulations, you're a real leader," and everything like that. And they said, "Would you like to give, a short 15-minute, 20-minute talk?" And I did. And at the end, they said, "Well, what's the one silver bullet you want to give everybody?" I was like, "The challenge is so much of this is contextual. But if there was one thing I want to give people is we need to be in a period where we're okay with asking the hard questions or asking better questions. Because again, the way we used to do things is no longer working. We've got to reinvent new playbooks. And so I would say whether you're in a company setting, you're in a civil society setting, if you're in a country setting, reward those who ask better questions. And it's not admiring the issue. You definitely have to lead to action. But if you don't expand your search space, in fact, one of the founders of AI, Herb Simon, he actually looked at decision making back in the 1930s and he came to the conclusion that humans don't usually go beyond what they know. And so whether that motivated him to later pursue AI or not, I'm not clear, but he did get a Nobel Prize for it. I'm actually finding one of the best uses for generative AI right now is sort of expanding people's search space. Not that the AI is always right. In fact, these are not necessarily by themselves fact-checking machines. But there have been cases where I went and there were some export controls that were passed, and I said, how could someone get around these export controls? And then what are the solutions to actually sort of address that and make it more legal and more abiding? We're also seeing, for example, for doctors, the best is actually when you pair a good clinician with an AI, and the AI says, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And maybe the clinician has never seen this disease before, but expands their search space. And so the one thing I would just tell to people as you navigate the world of 2025, 26 onwards, reward those who ask better questions, and then say, okay, given that question, what should we do about it? So that way you're always committing to action, but you're also expanding your search space of the possible.
So that's a great question, and it's a great sort of recommendation. And people have to be accepting of combinatorial thinking and outside of, like you said, the group think or comfort zone, right? And that's a challenge, though, right?
The art of a good leader is delivering change at a rate that someone can tolerate.
Yeah, and then a higher dimensionality also. So not just, two, three variables, but think about the interaction between all of these different kinds of variables. And then you use this example when you're using LLMs to kind of explore high dimensionality and other kind of points of view. You got to be careful though in your prompting because sometimes these LLMs have confirmation bias. They're just trying to validate what you're saying.
Right.
And so you got to carefully structure it so that you're not leading it to confirm what you want and that you'll genuinely will get a kind of a diversity of opinion. So you have to state that I want a diversity of opinion. I want to be challenged. You have to get the system. You have to build that context so it gives you a broader perspective. So, David, I really enjoyed this with you as always. You're just a tremendous individual. What just really contributing on a global scale in so many different areas. And definitely high dimensionality. You definitely do combinatorial thinking. You definitely are about equity and diversity and transparency and accountability. So I just want to commit and responsibility and of course, you work across all of the challenges, but also for abundance and tech for good and AI for good. So thank you again for coming in and sharing your perspectives with my audience.
Thank you, Stephen. And I would say thank you for highlighting all the positive change agents that you do. I celebrate that we've met. And like you said, I look forward to when we can actually do a Q&A together, fireside chat. That would be that will be a wonderful experience to share. Thank you.
Yeah, it'd be a lot of fun. We could have a lot of fun. Okay, David, thank you again and take care and safe travels because you and I both travel a lot. So
We're always on the move because that way we're quantum particles. So thank you.
yeah, and superposition and entanglement in some way as well, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the brand called You Videocast and Podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.